Hey guys, how's it going? This is WolfPad and welcome to a three-part series where I will teach you everything you need to know to start playing chess right away. On today's video, we'll be covering what a board is, what it looks like and how it works, how each of the pieces move and captures, including some special moves, and the rules of chess and the objective of chess. Let's get started. This is an empty chessboard. It's made up of 64 squares, which is 8 by 8, arranged in a checkered pattern. 32 light squares and 32 dark squares. The correct way to place a chessboard is to always have a light square on the bottom right corner of the board, no matter which side you're playing. In chess, we refer to columns on a chessboard as files, and the rows as ranks. The files are assigned letters from left to right, if you're white, according to the alphabet. First the A file, then the B file, C file, D, E, F, G, and H files to follow. The ranks are instead assigned ordinal numbers, increasingly as you get higher up the chessboard if you're white, and decreasing if you're black, starting with the first rank, second rank, third rank, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and finally the eighth rank. Specific squares on a chessboard are given coordinates, using the file letter and the rank number. For example, this square is C3. It's on the C file and on the third rank. This is G5. It's on the G file and on the fifth rank, and so on. Moving on to how the chess pieces work. We can categorize the pieces in 4 different categories: major pieces, minor pieces, pawns, and the king. As a whole, we call the pieces material. Starting with the rook, which is a major piece, the rook is valued at 5 points, moving and capturing in a plus type of movement. It can move as many number of squares as it likes until it hits another piece or the edge of the board. If the piece it hits is a friendly piece, it'll have to stop 1 square prior to it. If the piece it hits is an enemy piece, it can choose to capture it and take its place, like so. This applies to all the pieces in the game. Each side starts with 2 rooks. The second piece we'll be looking at is the bishop, which is a minor piece. The bishop is valued at 3 points and moves in an X type of movement, or diagonal, always staying in the same colored square it started on. It can move as many number of squares as it wants until it hits another piece or the edge of the board. You'll notice since the bishop can only move and capture on one type of colored square, it means it can only influence 32 of the 64 squares on the board, which makes it less powerful than the rook in most cases. Each side starts with 2 bishops. The third piece is the almighty queen, which is a major piece. The queen is valued at 9 points and moves in a way that is a combination of the rook and the bishop, sort of like a star movement. Thus, it can move any number of squares it wants until it hits another piece or the edge of the board. Due to its incredible range, it is considered the most powerful piece on the board, and is often a priority target for the opponent. Each side starts with only 1 queen. The fourth piece is going to be the king. Like the queen, the king can move in any direction, but only 1 square at a time, except in a very specific situation involving the rook. We'll get into that in a bit. The king is invaluable. When a side gets its king checkmated, it's game over, no matter how many pieces either side has. Obviously, each side starts with only 1 king. Next piece is the knight, which is a minor piece. The knight is valued at 3 points and is considered to be the trickiest piece of them all. It moves in an L-shaped pattern, 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square to the side. Unlike the previous pieces, the knight has some special properties. Firstly, the knight only captures on the square it lands on. So, if we move the knight like this, only a piece on that square can be captured. The second property, which has to do with the first one, is that the knight can jump over other pieces, which no other piece can do. So, if the knight wants to move here, but there are pieces on the way, it's no bother. Unlike the bishop, the knight is slow, but it can travel to any square on the board given enough time. Each side starts with 2 knights. The last piece we're going to look at is the pawn. The pawn is valued at only 1 point each, and in most scenarios it is considered the least powerful piece. However, you start with 8 of them. The pawn plays a vital role in the game of chess, and have some very special properties of their own. Firstly, the pawn moves and captures in different ways. It only moves forward on the file it started on. On its very first move, it may move 2 steps forward or only 1, up to the player. But every move after that, it can only move 1 square at a time. The way a pawn captures, though, is diagonally forwards. So, if the pawn is on e4, it can only capture pieces that are on d5 or f5. A piece on e5 cannot be captured and will be blocking the pawn from moving forwards. This makes pawn moves serious business because you cannot take them back. The pawn has some other special properties. If a pawn reaches the opposite end of the board, 8th rank for white or 1st rank for black, it can promote itself to any minor piece or major piece it wants, queen, rook, knight, or bishop, just not another pawn or another king. Also, there is a special capture that occurs when an enemy pawn moves 2 squares from its starting position and you have a pawn on the 5th rank or 4th rank for black in the adjacent file. On this move, and this move only, you can choose to capture said pawn en passant or in passing, sort of like triggering an ambush for the passing pawn. If you choose not to capture en passant and instead make another move, the option to capture that pawn en passant is lost for the rest of the game. A last point about pieces, going back to the king, is a move called castling. This move involves the king in either of the 2 rooks. While castling, the king can move 2 squares in the direction he wants to castle on, and simultaneously place a rook on the opposite side of the king, like so. You'll notice that the distance between the king and the rooks is not the same for both sides. Castling towards the rook that is closest is called short castling or kingside castling, and castling towards the rook that is furthest is called long castling or queenside castling. In both scenarios, the king moves 2 squares towards that direction and places the rook behind him, so to speak. The rules on when it's possible to castle and when it's not, we will go over next. So now that we know the basics about the board and the pieces, let's talk about the rules and objectives of chess. Here we have the positions of all the pieces at the start of the game. In chess, white always goes first. Once white makes the first move, black follows with his or her own move. Then it's back to white. So progresses the game during the entire match. The objective of chess is quite simple, to checkmate the opponent's king. To do this, a few conditions must be met. First, the king must be under attack. In chess, we call this a check. Second, there cannot be any defending pieces that may capture the checking piece. Third, there cannot be any defending pieces that may block the check. This is not applicable for checks created by knights, since they jump over pieces. Fourth, the king is unable to move to any other safe or available square. By this, I mean that the squares the king could move to are either occupied by friendly pieces or being attacked by enemy pieces. In other words, the player has no legal moves. More on that in a bit. If all conditions are met, the king is checkmated and the side with the checkmated king loses, while the side checkmating wins. There are 2 other ways to win a chess game. One is if the opponent simply resigns, the other is if the opponent runs out of time while you still have sufficient material. Sufficient material basically means that the side who won on time had the potential to deliver checkmate if the opponent who lost hadn't run out of time. We'll talk about when there is sufficient material and when there isn't on the next video. In chess, there is such a thing as a draw. There are basically 5 ways for a chess game to end in a draw. First, by agreement. Both players agree that the game is equal and neither side will likely win, so they shake hands and call it a day. 2. By repetition or perpetual check. If the exact same position is repeated 3 times during a chess game, a side can claim a draw. Very similar concept to a repetition, perpetual check comes about when one side can indefinitely check the opponent's king, and the defending side has no way to escape said checks. Here's an example. Even though white has an extra rook and 2 checkmate threats, which black can't parry at the same time, black's queen is in an ideal position to deliver checks to white's king and force a draw. Queen e1 check. King must move to h2. Queen e5 check. If the king goes back to the first rank, we just repeat with queen e1. If the king blocks the check with a pawn, we simply play queen e2, and no matter where the king goes, we can just bounce around the first 2 ranks indefinitely. Third, the 50 move rule. Usually happening during endgames. If the winning side cannot deliver checkmate to the defending side after 50 moves, where no material has been lost or no pawn has been moved, the game is a draw. For example, here we have a king, knight, and bishop against the lone king. Even though white has sufficient material to produce a checkmate, the knight and bishop checkmate is known to be tricky to pull off if you don't know exactly what you're doing. White only has 50 moves to pull it off, or it's a draw. Fourth, by insufficient material. When either side, or the side that wins on time, don't have sufficient pieces to deliver checkmate, it's considered a draw. For example, two lone kings cannot checkmate one another, so it's a draw. Last, by stalemate. This happens when the defending side has no legal moves, as in it cannot move any pieces, and yet their king is not in check. If this happens, the game ends in a draw, much to the dismay of the stronger side. Let's go back to legal moves for a moment. Basically, trying to move any piece in a way that goes against the rules is not legal. For example, trying to move a rook like a bishop or trying to move the queen like a knight. However, most illegal moves are closely connected with kings. A player cannot move their own king into check, or move any of their pieces in a way that would put their king into check. Those would be illegal moves. Online, the game itself won't even let you do those moves, even by accident. We'll get more in depth about what that means in the next video. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is way back when we covered castling. There are 4 conditions that must be met so that a player can legally castle. First, you cannot have moved neither the king nor the rook on the side you're trying to castle on. If you've moved either of those pieces, you can no longer castle. Note that if you move the rook on one side, but not the king, you may still yet castle on the other side. Second, there must be no pieces in between the king and the rook. Third, the king cannot be in check while trying to castle. That is, you cannot castle out of check. And last, the 2 squares the king has to travel through in order to castle cannot be attacked by any enemy pieces. Say you want to castle short. If either f1 or g1 is being attacked by an enemy piece, you cannot castle. That covers today's video. If you enjoyed what you saw and would like to see more, make sure to subscribe for more chess content. Also, leaving a like helps the channel a lot, so consider doing that if you think I deserve it. Catch you next time.